It's 1945. The world has just witnessed the most devastating war in history. Cities lie in ruins, millions are displaced, and Europe is in desperate need of rebuilding. But even as the Allies begin piecing the world back together, a new conflict is brewing, a secret conflict, one that will remain hidden from the public eye for decades. Behind closed doors, the United States and the Soviet Union are quietly fighting over an unusual prize: the brilliant but morally compromised minds of Nazi Germany's top scientists. These men held the keys to cutting-edge technology that could change the future, technologies that both the US and the Soviets were willing to secure by nearly any means necessary. This covert operation, hidden under layers of government secrecy and ethical compromise, became known as Operation Paperclip. World War II has ended, but the victory comes at an unimaginable cost. Europe's cities are gutted, infrastructure is shattered. In Germany alone, entire towns are flattened. But as the Allied forces move through the wreckage, they stumble upon something unexpected: hidden factories, underground laboratories, and storerooms filled with blueprints and prototypes for weapons and technologies unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. Among these discoveries, Allied intelligence finds advanced aircraft, guided missiles, synthetic fuels, and chemical agents. The crown jewel, the V-2 rocket, the first long-range guided ballistic missile capable of traveling over 200 miles at speeds up to 3,500 miles per hour. These weapons had terrorized London, and their technology was light years ahead of anything the Allies had. Faced with these breakthroughs, US officials realized the scientific expertise behind these creations could be the edge America needed in an emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. There was just one major problem. Most of these scientists weren't just loyal Germans. They were Nazi Party members, and in some cases, high-ranking officials involved in the regime's most horrifying crimes. While officially committed to bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, the United States made a choice that would remain controversial for generations. Instead of imprisoning or prosecuting some of these scientists, American intelligence agencies began working to recruit them. In September 1945, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, launched a covert operation to bring German scientists to the US, even if it meant hiding their past. This operation was soon given the codename Paperclip. The name Operation Paperclip was quite literal. American officials used paperclips to attach sanitized biographies over the original files of these scientists, obscuring any record of their Nazi affiliations or potential war crimes. In the eyes of the US government, these men weren't criminals. They were simply assets to be secured before the Soviets could get to them. The goal was to beat the Soviet Union in capturing the scientific minds that could propel a nation forward in everything from rocketry to biological warfare. But by doing so, the United States was forced to make profound moral compromises. How could they justify it? Wernher von Braun, if there's one name synonymous with Operation Paperclip, it's his. Von Braun was a visionary, a brilliant engineer who had been designing rockets since he was a teenager. By his late 20s, he was one of the key figures in the Nazi rocket program, developing the V-2 rocket, which the Germans unleashed on Allied cities. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, von Braun's team worked at Peenemünde, a remote German testing site. There, he led a group of over 4,000 scientists and engineers dedicated to perfecting the V-2. This missile, capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away, was a game-changer in warfare and the first real glimpse into the potential of space-bound rockets. But von Braun's legacy is a dark one. His V-2 program relied on forced labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Prisoners were subjected to brutal conditions, forced to work underground in cramped, dangerous tunnels with almost no light or ventilation. Many didn't survive the backbreaking labor, disease, or mistreatment. Thousands of lives were lost in the creation of these rockets. After Germany's defeat, von Braun and his team were taken into custody by US forces. Initially, they were interrogated, but soon the US military realized von Braun's expertise was too valuable to ignore. By 1945, he was quietly brought to the US under Paperclip, his war crimes largely ignored or rebranded as the unavoidable byproducts of wartime duty. Over the next 2 decades, von Braun would transform from a former SS officer to an American hero, leading NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and helping to land a man on the moon. Von Braun's achievements in America were groundbreaking, yet they were built on a foundation of suffering. He was welcomed as a national treasure, even as survivors of Mittelbau-Dora lived with trauma and loss. Was this price too high, or was it simply an ugly necessity in the race for technological superiority? But Paperclip wasn't just about rockets and space. The US sought expertise in medicine, chemical engineering, and biological warfare, areas where Nazi research had also advanced, albeit through unethical means. One of the most troubling figures in this regard was Dr. Kurt Blohm. Kurt Blohm was the head of Nazi Germany's biological warfare program. He experimented on concentration camp prisoners, testing plague, tuberculosis, and other deadly pathogens to develop bioweapons. During the Nuremberg trials, he was charged with conducting inhumane experiments on humans. Shockingly, he was acquitted. Not long after, he was recruited by the US under Operation Paperclip. Blom's expertise became instrumental to US efforts in understanding biological warfare. Though his actions were never fully investigated, he contributed valuable knowledge to the US Army's Chemical Corps, working on defensive measures against chemical and biological threats. His presence in the US raised serious ethical questions. Could the results of his brutal work ever be justified if they potentially protected millions? Another figure central to Operation Paperclip's story was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, a scientist often celebrated as the father of space medicine. Strughold's research on human endurance in extreme conditions became essential to NASA's space program, where understanding the human body's reaction to space travel was critical. Yet his past reveals an unsettling chapter. During the war, Strughold held a prominent position at the Luftwaffe's Aviation Medical Research Institute, where he oversaw research into human endurance in extreme conditions. This research often involved the exploitation of prisoners, subjected to brutal experiments that tested survival at high altitudes and exposure to freezing temperatures. At the Dachau concentration camp, inmates were forced into ice water tanks and left exposed to sub-zero temperatures to simulate conditions German pilots might encounter. Many subjects died or were left permanently scarred. Strughold denied involvement, but testimony from other scientists and documents captured after the war suggested he was more aware than he admitted. Despite these allegations, the US government brought Strughold to America under Paperclip. At the newly established Aeromedical Library in Texas, he spearheaded research that would prove invaluable to the future of space exploration. His contributions would lead to life support systems, spacesuit design, and techniques that enabled astronauts to survive in space. He was even honored posthumously, with NASA facilities bearing his name. But in recent years, as more evidence of his involvement in wartime atrocities surfaced, that legacy has been questioned. By honoring his achievements, some argue, we also risk overlooking the suffering that allowed him to achieve them. Not every German scientist accepted the invitation to work for the US under Operation Paperclip. Some felt morally conflicted, refusing to serve another country after the devastation of the war. One notable example was Dr. Gustav Hertz, a Nobel laureate and nuclear physicist who strongly opposed Hitler's regime. Despite the opportunity to advance his career in the US, Hertz chose not to participate, stating that his conscience would not allow him to work under the conditions of secrecy and compromise Paperclip required. Hertz instead sought asylum in the Soviet Union, where he continued his research. Other German scientists found themselves struggling with similar decisions, weighing the chance to advance their careers and contribute to scientific progress against the uncomfortable reality of assisting another superpower in its arms race. These scientists' refusal highlighted a tension at the heart of Operation Paperclip. For many involved, the goal of advancing human knowledge came at the cost of personal and ethical compromises. But the US government, driven by Cold War urgency, continued to recruit, finding scientists who were willing to make that compromise. As Paperclip continued, details began to leak, sparking debates within American government circles and the media. Many Americans were horrified to learn that former Nazi scientists, some of whom had contributed to the atrocities of the Holocaust, were not only living on American soil but also receiving funding and support from the government. Yet the full extent of Operation Paperclip remained hidden from public view, classified as top secret. Politicians feared that public backlash could damage the national security interests Paperclip was supposed to protect. Internal memos reveal government officials weighing the risks of scandal against the potential technological gains, choosing to keep the operation largely under wraps. Some Americans felt that using former enemies to protect national security was justified. Others were appalled, demanding transparency and justice. For many survivors of Nazi oppression, including Jewish communities and former Allied prisoners of war, Paperclip was nothing short of a betrayal. Families of concentration camp victims felt the US was giving these scientists a get-out-of-jail-free card, further compounding the emotional wounds of the war. With the scientists from Operation Paperclip, the US gained an edge in several key areas of technology. German expertise accelerated advancements in rocketry, space exploration, and military science. By the 1950s, this work had paved the way for the development of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads halfway across the world. Von Braun and his team were instrumental in developing the Redstone and Jupiter rockets, early prototypes of America's ballistic missile program. By the late 1950s, this technology would be used in the launch of Explorer 1, the first successful American satellite, marking a significant milestone in the space race. The US wasn't just catching up to the Soviets, it was poised to take the lead. But the space race wasn't just about exploration. For the US and Soviet Union, it was a matter of national pride and global dominance. Winning this race wasn't just about reaching the stars. It meant demonstrating which ideology would control the future. And at the heart of America's strategy were German scientists who had once been part of the Nazi war machine. Today, historians, ethicists, and scientists still debate the legacy of Operation Paperclip. On one hand, the contributions of these scientists propelled the US into the modern age of technology and space exploration. Without them, it's possible that the Soviets would have reached these milestones first, reshaping the global balance of power. Survivors of Nazi crimes were forced to live in a world where their tormentors had escaped punishment and were celebrated as pioneers. Historians point out that Paperclip set a precedent for future compromises. In the ensuing years, the Cold War would see the US and the Soviet Union. As we look back on this operation, we're reminded that history isn't always black and white. Often it's the grey areas that leave the deepest mark. What do you think? Should scientific progress be pursued at any cost, or are there moral boundaries we shouldn't cross? Let us know in the comments. If you found this episode insightful, be sure to like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more hidden stories from history.